I pick up my life and take it with me, and I put it down in Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Harlem, any place that is north and east and not Dixie. I pick up my life and take it on the train to Los Angeles, Bakersfield, Seattle, Oakland, Salt Lake, any place that is north and west and not south. I am fed up with Jim Crow laws, people who are cruel and afraid, who lynch and run, who are scared of me and me of them. So I pick up my life and take it away on a one-way ticket, gone up north, gone out west, gone. When I was 13 years old, my mother moved to a town called Lincoln, Illinois. I was in the 8th grade, grammar school. At that time, we didn't have junior high school, so when you graduated from the 8th grade, you went to high school. In this 8th grade graduating class in Lincoln, Illinois, on the day that I entered, the students were talking about holding a class election. It seems that they'd heard that the high school across the street had class officers, so they wanted to have officers too. Well, the teacher was explaining to the class that day the duties of class officers. She said, of course, that the president had to know how to run a meeting and the secretary had to know how to write and so on. And then when she got to the office of class poet, she stressed rhythm. She said a poem must have rhythm. Well, now, I was a stranger in the class. I'd entered about 4 weeks after the school year had begun. I didn't know any of the other pupils. They didn't know me. I was one of 2 Negro children in that class. I didn't expect to be elected to any class office, being new there, you know. And besides, on the way home from school that day, the one other Negro pupil, a girl, told me that she never heard of colored children being elected to anything in the schools there in Lincoln, Illinois. She said, this is a prejudiced little town. Well, she was just about right. It was a kind of American small town that, at that time, did not permit Negroes to eat in any of the restaurants downtown. If you were colored and you went to the movies, you had to sit in the last row on the left. If that single row was crowded that night, you couldn't go to the movies if you were a Negro. Well, the next day, when the class election was held, sure enough, all of the officers were nominated and voted upon and elected, except one office, and the colored girl who'd been in the class all the 8 terms with the other pupils was not nominated or elected to anything. And, of course, my name wasn't mentioned. But when they got on to the very last office, down to the very bottom of the blackboard, underneath Sergeant-at-Arms even, that was the office of class poet. And there weren't any nominations at all. The pupils looked around at each other, and it seemed that nobody in the class looked like a poet. Nobody even looked like he or she could write a poem, so the problem was who to nominate for class poet. The teacher said, you do want a class poet, don't you? And all the youngsters said, well, yes, we do. And she said, well, you have to nominate somebody. So finally, a little white boy got up and turned around and looked at me and called my name. And right away, the whole class said, unanimously, I was elected the class poet. Well, I thought that was just because nobody else wanted the office. But in thinking about it that night a little more carefully, I remembered that the teacher the day before, in defining what a poet had to possess, had stressed the word rhythm. And I knew that, in my experience, almost all American white people at that time seemed to think that all Negroes could sing and dance and that all of us had a sense of rhythm, sort of conventional belief, you know. So I came to the conclusion that maybe poetry, rhythm, color, me, a Negro, that little boy had thought he must have some rhythm to give a poem, and maybe that's why I was elected the class poet. At any rate, I'm glad that I was. Up to that time, I had not really thought about writing in any serious way at all, although my mother liked poetry. She used to recite poetry a great deal. In fact, she used to make me recite poems on church programs and school programs when I was little. And I must say I didn't like it very much, having to stand up in public and say rhymes. But when I began to work on my class poem, and I had all winter to write it, you know, it wasn't due till graduation in the spring, I began to sort of take an interest in reading poetry. My class poem turned out to be just about the longest poem I've ever written, even up to now. It was 16 verses long. I had 8 for the class and 8 for our teachers, because we had 8 teachers in the school. Well, it's a wonder anybody liked it, but when I stood up and read the poem at graduation in June, everybody applauded very loudly, and I was so pleased by all that applause that ever since that time I've been writing poetry. Now, of course, that wouldn't be too unusual today, but when I was in high school 40 years ago, it seemed that most teachers liked only poets who had lived 100 or 200 years before their students were born. You know, poets like Keats and Shelley and Longfellow and Browning and Byron. But this particular teacher, Ethel Weimer was her name, would read to her classes from living poets. She read to us from Carl Sandburg, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Edgar Lee Masters, Vachel Lindsay, and I began to see that poetry could have some connection with life. The poet that I particularly liked during my high school days was Carl Sandburg. And so when I began to try to write poems seriously, I tried to write like Sandburg. Sandburg at that time had just published his first book. He was being attacked by most of the literary critics as radical, as too far out, as extreme. He didn't use rhyme. Free verse, as his poetry was termed, was considered almost like abstract painting was in the 20s and 30s, you know? Well, nevertheless, I like Sandburg. Perhaps I liked him because he wrote about things that I knew about. He wrote about the wheat fields of the Middle West. He wrote about the steel mills in cities like Cleveland and Chicago, where my stepfather worked. He wrote about the slums. He wrote about poor people. Then, the other poetic influence was that of Paul Laurence Dunbar. Dunbar was a very famous Negro poet at the turn of the century. He died about the time that I was born, but when I was a child, almost every Negro home had a book of Dunbar's poetry, and I had sort of grown up on Dunbar. Well, now, Dunbar wasn't like Sandburg at all in style. He wrote in a sort of singing, rhymed verse, quite a deal of humor in his poetry, very often in the quaint Negro dialect of the post-Civil War period. Now, in trying to write like both Sandburg and Dunbar, it's a wonder I didn't fall between two stools. But both of them certainly influenced my thinking and my poetic styles. My earliest serious poem to be published was a poem called The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I wrote this poem when I was 18, wrote it on a train going to Mexico just after I'd graduated from high school. My father lived in Mexico City. On the train, as we crossed the Mississippi River just outside St. Louis, sunset time, I saw this great muddy river flowing down toward the heart of the South, and I began to think about what it had meant to the Negro people in the past. How in slavery time, to be sold down the Mississippi was, I'd heard, the worst thing that could happen to a slave, because if they sent you down into the rice fields, into the Delta, the hot regions around New Orleans, you might not live very long. And then I remembered reading that Abraham Lincoln, as a young man, had gone down the Mississippi. He'd seen the slave market in New Orleans, the buying and selling of human beings, and he never forgot it. It was Lincoln who, many years later, signed the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the black slaves. And so these thoughts went into this poem of mine that I wrote down on this train shortly after we'd gone across this river in the sunset. And from Mexico City, I sent the poem to a Negro magazine called The Crisis, the organ of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers.
I went to Columbia University in New York City for a year. I didn't like Columbia very well. A big university in the very heart of a big city. It didn't seem to me to have what I thought was a feeling of college life or campus life. And then, at that time, there was prejudice at Columbia. I had difficulty getting a room in the dormitory as a Negro student. And then, being interested in writing, I wanted to become a member of the staff of the Columbia College newspaper, The Spectator. And so I tried out for it. You had to go through sort of preliminary tests and show some ability. And do you know what they assigned me to? Me, a Negro student, they assigned me to society and fraternity news. And they knew very well that I had no access to most of the fraternity houses or dances that the white students went to. And so I was unsuccessful in making the staff of The Spectator. My father had wanted me to become a mining engineer. By that time, I'd made up my mind that I'd like to be a writer. We didn't agree on objectives. So at the end of the year, I wrote my father in Mexico City and told him that I had decided to try to be a writer, and if he didn't approve of my plans, he needn't send me any more money. Well, he didn't send me any more money. I found myself in New York City with only $13 at the end of my college year, and that is what I started out in life on. Ever since that time, I've been making my own living, and with this $13, I went down to Harlem, got a room, and began to look for a job. Here on the edge of hell stands Harlem, remembering the old lies, the old kicks in the back, the old be patient they told us before. Sure, we remember. Now, when the man at the corner store says sugar's gone up another 2 cents and bread 1, and there's a new tax on cigarettes, we remember the job we never had, never could get, and can't have now because we're colored. So we stand here on the edge of hell in Harlem and look out on the world and wonder what we're going to do in the face of what we remember. I eventually found work on the boats, so I went to sea. I made a trip to Africa, all up and down the west coast. It was there that I saw the meaning of colonialism, because at that time, of course, almost all of Africa belonged to the great European powers. After working on the boats for about 2 years, I decided one day in Rotterdam that I'd like to see Paris. And I thought perhaps I'd better go see Paris right then and there, because I was working on a rusty old tub of a ship that didn't seem to me very seaworthy. The ocean was extremely rough that winter, and I thought, well, I'll get off and go see Paris. I had only $25 coming to me. I drew it. I bought a ticket to Paris, got on the train in Rotterdam around midnight, got to Paris at 7 o'clock in the morning, cold, snowy, February morning. I didn't know a soul in all of Europe. But I thought I knew French pretty well because I'd had 3 years French in high school and I'd had a year at Columbia. But it turned out that when I tried my French out in the cafe of the Gare du Nord in Paris that morning when I got off the train being hungry, asked for some breakfast, I said, "Donnez-moi des œufs, s'il vous plaît, du jambon." They looked at me and didn't give me anything. I was asking for ham and eggs, and I didn't realize the French don't eat ham and eggs anyway for breakfast. Then I began to realize that what I was saying didn't penetrate the French ear, so I saw some nice rolls right in front of me on the counter. The coffee urn was bubbling, so I pointed to the coffee urn, I pointed at the rolls, and right away I got coffee and rolls. So I learned that you can get almost anything you want anywhere in the world just by using sign language. That is, you can get almost anything except a job. Finally, I got work as a doorman in a nightclub. The salary was your dinner and tips. Well, I was delighted just to have the dinner, so I would go to work especially early in order to eat, and I would work all night standing outside this door and hailing taxis for people. I found out, however, that Paris, like Chicago, has or had at that time a certain gangster element, and it turned out that I was working at a gangster nightclub. They had a great many fights inside. They fought in all sorts of languages, very seldom in English, and I, as doorman, would be called upon to come inside and stop the fights. So I didn't stay there very long. I finally found another job in another nightclub, a club called the Grand Duke, right in the middle of Montmartre. I was employed as a second cook,
Well, since I couldn't cook anything, fortunately for me, the title second cook really meant dishwasher. And so, washing pots and pans every night in the kitchen of the Grand Duke, I used to hear the jazz band playing outside in the cabaret part. They had a very good jazz combination from New York. Negro musicians like the drummer Buddy Gilmore played there. Kaiser Marshall sometimes was on drums, too. And so this excellent little band began to draw quite a few people to this club. People like the Prince of Wales, who is now the Duke of Windsor, used to come. And from Hollywood, Anita Loos and movie actress Gloria Swanson. It was a very nice club. Eventually, they brought Bricktop there as the hostess, and she began her European career in this little club called the Grand Duke. I remember she arrived one night just off the boat from Le Havre, absolutely penniless, because someone had stolen her pocketbook on the pier. And so Brick really began her international career without a cent. Well, while she was singing outside in the club, I would be washing dishes in the kitchen and sometimes thinking out a poems that the critics called jazz poems. So my poetic career is really all tied up with dishwashing in this little club called the Grand Duke.
Here on the edge of hell stands Harlem, remembering the old lies, the old kicks in the back, the old be patient they told us before. Sure, we remember. Now when the man at the corner store says sugar's gone up another 2 cents and bread 1, and there's a new tax on cigarettes, we remember the job we never had, never could get, and can't have now because we're colored. So we stand here on the edge of hell in Harlem and look out on the world and wonder what we're going to do in the face of what we remember. The Negro with the trumpet at his lips has dark moons of weariness beneath his eyes, where the smoldering memory of slave ships blaze to the crack of whips about his thighs. The Negro with the trumpet at his lips has a head of vibrant hair tamed down, patent leathered now until it gleams like jet, were jet a crown. The music from the trumpet at his lips is honey mixed with liquid fire. The rhythm from the trumpet at his lips is ecstasy distilled from old desire. Desire that is longing for the moon, where the moonlight's but a spotlight in his eyes. Desire that is longing for the sea, where the seas are bar glass, sucker size. The Negro with the trumpet at his lips, whose jacket has a fine one-button roll, does not know upon what riff the music slips its hypodermic needle to his soul. But softly, as a tune comes from his throat, trouble mellows to a golden note. The very first poem that I sold was a jazz poem. It was a poem about the Charleston. The Charleston was the dance that had begun at the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem, spread to Broadway, was brought to Europe first by Josephine Baker, and then went all around the world. Well, this little Charleston poem of mine, and 2 others, I sent to a magazine called Vanity Fair. That was a very smart New York magazine at that time, and they bought these 3 poems, and they paid me 50 cents a line. But my 3 poems were quite short, and when I got the check and looked at it, wasn't very much money. So I thought to myself, well, from now on, I'll cut all my poetic lines in half and make 2 out of them and get bigger checks. So now you understand when you see my poems having very short lines, how I became aware of the value of shortening the line in poetry. Commercial reasons. I sort of went backwards from an interest in jazz to an interest in the folk roots of jazz. I went backwards from jazz to the blues, and the blues really are the basis of jazz, and to the spirituals, the great Negro folk songs of the slave period. And having tried to write poems in the syncopated idiom of jazz, I then began to try to write poems in the folk idiom of the blues and the spirituals. These poems, my blues poems particularly, seem to attract considerable attention. My first book, published by Alfred Knopf, was called The Weary Blues, and ever since that time, I've written a number of poems as nearly as I can make them in the exact form of the Negro folk blues. The spirituals, of course, have no strict poetic form. There are some very beautiful lyrics in some of the spirituals, but no single spiritual lyric will be very much like another as a rule. The blues, however, do have a strict poetic form. The blues form is one long line repeated and a third line that rhymes with the first two. And, of course, the musical form of the blues is usually that of 12 bars. This is a folk blues that I remember from my childhood. I'm going down to the railroad and lay my head on the track. Going down to the railroad, lay my head on the track. If I see the train a-comin', I'll jerk it back. Well, now, you see, the form of the blues, the three lines, the mood of the blues is certainly clearly indicated there. Sadness, but a little twist somewhere in the thought, somewhere in the verse, to make people smile, sometimes even to make you laugh. And I think it's this quality of sadness mingled with humor that has come from the blues into jazz and that causes that music to be loved all around the world. The blues, unlike the spirituals, which are group songs, or were originally certainly group songs, congregational church songs, religious songs sung by many people banded together at camp meetings or prayer meetings. The blues, on the other hand, are individual songs. They're usually sung by one man or one woman alone. And therefore you can sort of classify the blues as masculine and feminine in theme, because the men's blues are almost always about being out of work, broke, hungry, maybe a long ways from home, no ticket to get back. In other words, they're sort of economic blues. The women's blues, on the other hand, are almost always about love. Very often a woman will be singing about some man who's gone off and left her before she's ready for him to go, or something like that. I went to the gypsies. Gypsy sitting all alone. I said, "Tell me, Gypsy, when will my gal be home?" Gypsy said, "Silver, put some silver in my hand, and I'll look into the future and tell you all I can." I crossed her palm with silver, then she started in to lie. She said, "Now listen, mister, she'll be here by and by." Oh, what a lie. I've been waiting and a-waiting, and she ain't come home yet. Something must have happened to make my gal forget. I hates a lying gypsy. Will take good money from you. Tell you pretty stories and take your money from you. But if I was a gypsy, I would take your money too. Listen, Kid Sleepy, don't you want to run around to the other side of the house where the shade is? It's sunny here and your skin'll turn a reddish purple in the sun. Kid Sleepy said, "I don't care." Listen, Kid Sleepy, don't you want to get up and go to work downtown somewhere to earn enough for lunches and car fare? Kid Sleepy said, "I don't care." Or would you rather, Kid Sleepy, just stay here? Rather just stay here. Miss Gardner's in her garden, Miss Yardman's in her yard. Miss Michaelmas is at the Mass, and I'm getting tired. Lord, I'm getting tired. The nations they is fighting, and the nations they done fit. Sometimes I think that white folks ain't worth a little bit. No, ma'am, ain't worth a little bit. Last week, they lynched a colored boy. They hung him to a tree. That colored boy ain't said a thing, but we all should be free. Yes, ma'am, we all should be free. Not meaning to be sassy and not meaning to be smart, but sometimes I think that white folks just ain't got no heart. No, ma'am, just ain't got no heart. Daddy-O Buddy-O works at the foundry. Daddy-o Buddy-o rides the State Street streetcar, transfers to the west side. Polish, bohunk, Irish, grabs a load of sunrise as he rides out on the prairie. Never knew DuSable, has a lunch to carry. Iron lifting iron makes iron of chocolate muscles. Iron lifting iron makes hammer beat of drum beat, and the heat molds and melts and molds it on red heart, become an anvil, until a glow is lighted in the eyes once soft benighted, and the cotton field is frightened 1,000 miles away. They draw up restrictive covenants in Australia too, they say. Our president takes up important matters still left by VJ Day. Congress cases Russia. The Tribune's hair turns gray. Daddy-o Buddy-o signs his name in uphill letters on the check that is his pay. But if he wasn't in a hurry, he wouldn't write so bad that way, Daddy-o. A great many of my characters and situations in my books come out of Harlem Live. The emotions in a number of my poems are the emotions of the Harlem people. They come from communities where schooling has often been very poor. They themselves may be, and very often are, quite bright men and women, but their backgrounds academically hasn't been of the best. And they bring to Harlem with them many of the problems and prejudices of the Old South. They also bring sometimes a quite rich and somewhat different vocabulary. And it's this vocabulary and this way of talking that people seem to like. Much of the material from my simple stories comes from things that I actually overhear in the street, in cafes, sometimes even at home. Recently I wrote a little simple sketch which grew out of something that my uncle-in-law said one day. They were talking around the dinner table about people going to heaven, and he said, every time I hear of anybody going to heaven, he always wants to sit on the right hand of God. He said, the right hand must be so crowded, can anybody else get on there? When I get to heaven, he said, I'm going to run right straight toward the left, because I know there's plenty of room. So I took that and developed a little simple story from it. When I get on the A train and get back to 125th Street and come out and look around, and there I am in the middle of great, big, black, beautiful Harlem, I'm happy. You know the famous Duke Ellington song, Take the A Train? Well, if you get on that A train on the 8th Avenue subway, if you get on, say, at 42nd Street, you will find perhaps that 2/3 of the passengers on that particular train are colored. When that train gets to 125th Street, about half of them get out. When it gets to the next stop, most of the others get out. From there on, the train will have very few colored people on it to the end of its run. Now, white New Yorkers live largely south of Harlem and north of Harlem. Those who live north of Harlem have to go under Harlem to get home, and sometimes those travelers never see Harlem at all because they only go under it. And a great many people in New York have never even visited Harlem. Mama, please brush off my coat. I'm going down the street. Where are you going, daughter? To see my sugar sweet. Who is your sugar, honey? Turn around. I'll brush behind. He is that young man, Mama, I can't get off my mind. Daughter, once upon a time, let me brush the hem. Your father, yes, he was the one. I felt that way about him. But it was a long time ago. He up and went his way. I hope that wild young son of a gun rots in hell today. Mama, Dad couldn't be still young. He was young yesterday. He was young when he... Turn around so I can brush your back, I say. I woke up this morning about 3:30. All the women's in town was gathered around me. Sweet gals was a-moaning, Sylvester's gonna die. And 100 pretty mamas bowed their heads to cry. I woke up a little later, about 4:30. Doctor and undertaker's both at my door. Black gals was a-begging, you can't leave us here. Brown skins crying,
Daddy, honey, baby, don't go, dear. But I felt my times a-comin', and I knowed us dying fast. I seed the River Jordan a-creepin' muddy past. But I still sweet Papa Vesta, yes, sir, long as life do last. So I hollers, come here, babies, for to love your daddy right. And I reaches up to hug 'em when the Lord put out the light. Then everything was darkness in a great big night. There are certain disadvantages in living in a racially unified area. Some of the disadvantages are that sometimes we feel we don't get the full civic services that other communities get. Sometimes if the garbage isn't collected on time, we're inclined to blame it on color and say, oh, well, they don't collect Negroes' garbage. But I think by and large, Harlem lives very much like the rest of New York City. One of the interesting things about Harlem to me as a writer, however, is that I would think about 75% of the people there are roamers. As such, they don't have very much space oftentimes. Whole families, mother and father and 2 or 3 children, live in 2 or 3 rooms, usually sometimes not more than 2 rooms, you know, and sometimes children grow up in rooms rather than in homes. Well, on the other hand, up on Sugar Hill, where the big, beautiful apartment houses are, where people live like Rose Morgan, the woman who has the wonderful beauty establishments, the Rosemeda establishments, where Joe Louis used to live, up there, life is very much the same as it would be on Central Park West. We are the American heartbreak, the rock on which freedom stubbed its toe, the great mistake that Jamestown made long ago. That is one of my poems about the problems of the Negro people in relation to American democracy. Perhaps we should say the problems of American democracy in relation to the Negro people, because for some reason the Negro in America has always been called a problem. Well, I guess we are. Many of my poems try to capture various aspects of this problem. I've written poems about housing. For example, when Negroes move into some American communities, even if it's just one Negro family moving into a block, within a few days, signs begin to go up for sale. And usually, the real estate brokers who handle the sales double the prices on those houses because they know that Negro people often have a hard time buying decent homes, and so they charge them more for the homes that eventually they are willing to sell them. Well, I try to put these things, these problems, into poetry. In recent years, more and more Americans have been leaving the big cities for suburban areas, and among them have been a number of Negroes who are able to buy homes in the suburbs. Well, Negroes move to, let's say, St. Albans. White people flee from St. Albans, move a little further out on Long Island. Negroes, those of means, then themselves try to move a little further out on Long Island. White people flee a little further. And after a while, you know, you get to the ocean. So I suppose that suburbia eventually will be only in the sea. I don't know where else it could be. Around New York, at any rate. White coats, white aprons, white dresses, white shoes. Pain and a learning to take away to Alabama. Practice on a State Street cancer. Practice on a stockyards rupture. Practice on the small appendix of 26 girl at the corner. Learning skills of surgeons brown and wonderful with longing to cure ills of Africa, democracy, and mankind. Also ills quite common among all who stand on 2 feet. Brown hands, black hands, golden hands in white coat, nurse's hands on suture, miracle maternity, pain on hind legs rising, pain tamed and subsiding like a mule broke to the halter. Charities checked money, AIDS triumphant entry squalling after bitter thrust of bearing chocolate and blood. Projection of a day
Tears of joy and Coca-Cola twinkle on the rubber gloves he's wearing. A crown of sweat gleams on his forehead. In the white moon of the amphitheater, magi are staring. The light on the Palmolive building shines like a star in the east. Nurses turn glass doorknobs, opening into corridors. A mist of iodine and ether follows the young doctor. Cellophanes his long stride. Cellophanes his future. In my poetry, I've never been at a loss for moving subject matter because I myself have faced many of these racial problems all over the United States, having lived from one end of the country to the other in my now more than 50 years of life. One of the dramatic ways of expressing the race problem I've found is to express it through the eyes of a child. And I have done this in both stories and poetry. One of my best-known stories is a story called One Friday Morning about a Negro high school girl who is awarded a prize in high school and then is denied the prize when some of the community organizations object to a Negro child receiving it. One of my poems most widely reprinted is a poem about a little colored girl, a poem called Merry-Go-Round, which was written during the war. There was quite a large migration of Negro workers from the South to northern industrial centers during and after the last war, and I imagined a family in which there was a little girl of maybe 6 or 7 years of age moving to a town like Detroit, her father perhaps coming to work in the automobile plants there, coming from maybe a state like Mississippi where segregation is legal. This little child in this northern industrial town one day goes to a carnival. She sees a merry-go-round going around and she wants to ride, but being a very little girl and colored and remembering the segregations of the South, she doesn't quite know whether Negro children can ride on merry-go-rounds in the North or not, and if they can ride, she doesn't know where. Where is the Jim Crow section on this merry-go-round, mister? 'Cause I want to ride. Down south where I come from, white and colored can't sit side by side. Down south on the train, there's a Jim Crow car. On the bus, we're put in the back. But there ain't no back to a merry-go-round. Where's a horse for a kid that's black? They took me out to some lonesome place. They said, "Do you believe in the great white race?" I said, "Mister, to tell you the truth, I'd believe in anything if you just turned me loose." The white man said, "Boy, can it be you are standing there assassin me?" They hit me in the head and knocked me down, and then they kicked me on the ground. A Klansman said, "Listen, look me in the face and tell me you believe in the great white race." The lazy, laughing South with blood on its mouth. The sunny-faced South, be strong, idiot-brained. The child-minded South, scratching in the dead fire's ashes for a Negro's bones. Cotton and the moon, warmth, earth, warmth, the sky, the sun, the stars, the magnolia-scented South, beautiful like a woman, seductive as a dark-eyed whore, passionate, cruel, honey-lipped, syphilitic. That is the South. And I, who am black, would love her, but she spits in my face. And I, who am black, would give her many rare gifts, but she turns her back upon me. So now I seek the North, the cold-faced North, for she, they say, is a kinder mistress, and in her house my children may escape the spell of the South. I am your son, white man. Georgia dusk in the Turpentine woods, one of the pillars of the temple fell. You are my son like hell. The moon over the Turpentine woods. The southern night full of stars, great big yellow stars. What's a body but a toy? Juicy bodies of nigger wenches, blue-black against black fences. Oh, you little bastard boy, what's a body but a toy? The scent of pine wood stings the soft night air. What's the body of your mother? Silver moonlight everywhere. What's the body of your mother? Sharp pine scent in the evening air. A nigger night, a nigger joy, a little yellow bastard boy. No, you ain't my brother. Niggers ain't my brother. Not ever. Niggers ain't my brother. The southern night is full of stars, great big yellow stars. Oh, sweet as earth, dust dark bodies give sweet birth to little yellow bastard boys. Get on back there in the night. You ain't white. The bright stars scatter everywhere, pine wood scent in the evening air. A nigger night, a nigger joy. I am your son, white man, a little yellow bastard boy. I walked the streets till the shoes wore off my feet. I don't walk the streets till the shoes wore off my feet. I've been looking for a job so that I could eat. I couldn't find no job, so I went to the WPA. Couldn't find no job, so I went to the WPA. WPA man told me, you got to live here a year and a day. A year and a day, Lord, in this great big lonesome town. A year and a day in this great big lonesome town. I might starve for a year, but that extra day would get me down. The folks with no titles in front of their names all over the world are raring up and talking back to the folks called Mister. You say you thought everybody was called Mister? No, son, not everybody. Down south in Dixie, often they won't call Negroes Mister. In China, before what happened, they had no intention of calling coolies Mister. Dixie to Singapore, Cape Town to Hong Kong, the Misters won't call lots of other folks Mister. They call them, hey, George, here, Sally, listen, coolie, hurry up, boy, and things like that. George Sally Coolie Boy gets tired sometimes. So all over the world today, folks with not even Mister in front of their names are raring up and talking back to those called Mister. From Harlem past Hong Kong to Cape Town, talking back. Shut up, says old Senator Eastland. Shut up, says the governor of South Carolina. Shut up, says the governor of Singapore. Shut up, says Ververd. Hell no, shut up, say the people with no titles in front of their names. Hell no. It's time to talk back now. History says it's time. And the radio, too, foggy with propaganda that says a mouthful and don't mean half of what it says. But it's true anyhow. Liberty, freedom, democracy. True anyhow, no matter how many liars use those words. The people with no titles in front of their names hear those words and shout them back at the misters, lords, generals, viceroys, governors of South Carolina, Eastlands, Ververds. Shut up, people. Shut up, shut up. Shut up, George. Shut up, Sally. Shut up, Coolie. Shut up, Indian. Shut up, boy. George, Sally, Coolie, Indian boy. Black, brown, yellow, bent down, working, earning riches for the whole world with no title in front of name. Just man, woman, tired, says, no, shut up. Hell no, shut up. So naturally, there's trouble in these our times because of people with no titles in front of their names. I know I am the Negro problem, being wined and dined,
answering the usual questions that come to white minds which seek demurely to probe in polite way the why and wherewithal of darkness, USA, wondering how things got this way. In current democratic night, murmuring gently over Fraise du Bois, I'm so ashamed of being white. The lobster is delicious, the wine divine, and center of attention at the dumbest table, mine. To be a problem on Park Avenue at 8 is not so bad. Solutions to the problem, of course and anyhow, must wait. In the quarter of the Negroes, Belgium shadows Leopold, Premier Downing aging, General Bourse beleaguered, Eastland and Vervoer deceased. Dead or alive, their ghosts cast shadows in the quarter of the Negroes, where Negroes sing so well. Negroes sing so well, sing so well, so well. Well? They asked me right at Christmas if my blackness would it rub off. I said, ask your mama. In the quarter of the Negroes, answer questions answer, and answers with a question, and the Talmud is corrected by a student with a fez, who is to Jesuit as North Pole is to South, or Ezekiel to Alabama, or Sammy Davis to the Met, La Scala. Hip boots deep in the blues, and I never had a hip boot on. Hair blowing back in the wind, and I never had that much hair. Diamonds in pawn, and I never had a diamond in my natural life. Me in the White House, and ain't never had a black house. Do, Jesus, Lord. Amen. Dreams and nightmares. Nightmares, dreams. Oh, dreaming that the Negroes of the South have taken over, voted all the Dixiecrats right out of power. Comes the colored hour. Martin Luther King is governor of Georgia. Dr. Roy Wilkins, his chief advisor. Zelma Watson George, the high grand worthy. In white-pillared mansions, sitting on their wide verandas, wealthy Negroes have white servants. White sharecroppers work the black plantations, and colored children have white mammies. Mammy Fulbus, Mammy Eastland, Mammy Talmadge, Mammy Wallace. Dear, dear, darling old white mammies, sometimes even buried with our family. Dear old Mammy Fulbus, dear old Mammy Wallace. Culture, they say, is a two-way street. Hand me my mint julep, Mammy. Hurry up. Make haste.
This is Langston Hughes. Many of my poems are poems about the Negro people in relation to American democracy and about the problems of American democracy in general as applied to race. The first poem is called Afro-American Fragment. So long, so far away is Africa. Not even memories alive, save those that history books create, save those that songs beat back into the blood, beat out of blood with words sad sung in strange un-Negro tongue. So long, so far away is Africa. Subdued and time lost are the drums, and yet through some vast mist of race there comes this song I do not understand, this song of atavistic land, of bitter yearnings lost without a place. So long, so far away is Africa's dark face. This is The Negro Speaks of Rivers, one of my earliest poems written in 1920, just after I came out of high school. The way this poem came to be written was that I was going to Mexico to visit my father, who lived in Mexico City, and on the train going across the Mississippi River, just outside St. Louis, I looked out the window and I saw this great muddy river flowing down toward the heart of the South, and I began to think about what this river meant to the Negro people, how, in a sense, our history was linked to this river, how in slavery time
my grandmother told me that to be sold down the Mississippi was one of the worst things that could happen to a Negro slave. And then I remembered that I'd read about Abraham Lincoln going down the Mississippi as a young man, and he went on a raft to New Orleans, and he saw human beings bought and sold in the slave market there, and he was so horrified by this that he never forgot it. And many years later, of course, we know that it was Lincoln who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And so, as the train went on into the gathering dusk, because it had been about sunset when we crossed the river, I took my father's letter out of my pocket and began to write down on the back of his letter this poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. This one is a poem almost as old as The Negro Speaks of Rivers. It was written when I was perhaps 21. It's called Negro. I am a Negro, black as the night is black, black like the depths of my Africa. I've been a slave. Caesar told me to keep his doorsteps clean. I brushed the boots of Washington. I've been a worker. Under my hand the pyramids arose. I made mortar for the Woolworth building. I've been a singer. All the way from Africa to Georgia I carried my sorrow songs. I made ragtime. I've been a victim. The Belgians cut off my hands in the Congo. They lynch me now in Mississippi. I am a Negro, black as the night is black, black like the depths of my Africa. American Heartbreak. I am the American heartbreak, rock on which freedom stumps its toe, the great mistake that Jamestown made long ago. Dream Variations. This poem, like the first one that I read, has overtones of Africa. To fling my arms wide in some place of the sun, to whirl and to dance till the white day is done, then rest at cool evening beneath a tall tree, while night comes on gently, dark like me. That is my dream. To fling my arms wide in the face of the sun, dance, whirl, whirl, till the quick day is done. Rest at pale evening, a tall, slim tree, night coming tenderly, black like me. When I was a child in Lawrence, Kansas, the town where I lived until I was about 13 years old, we used to attend a little church, and in this church, it was a Methodist church, by the way, I used to hear some of the old spirituals sung on Sunday mornings by the congregation, and at that time I didn't know that I was going to be a writer. I didn't have any idea that these songs would someday influence my own creative sensibilities. But years later, when I began to consciously write in the folk forms of the Negro people, I wrote a series of poems included in this book of mine under the title Feet of Jesus, a series of poems in which you can quite clearly see the influence of the Negro spirituals. This one is called Feet of Jesus, the poem that gives the title to the entire section, and it's so short I think you might almost call it the breath of the spiritual.
It goes like this. At the feet of Jesus, sorrow like a sea. Lordy, let your mercy come drifting down on me. At the feet of Jesus, at your feet I stand. Oh, my precious Jesus, please reach out your hand. Another very short poem in this genre is Prayer. I ask you this, which way to go? I ask you this, which sin to bear? Which crown to put upon my hair? I do not know, Lord God, I do not know. Here's a poem about a sinner who is a little bit afraid about what might happen on Judgment Day, and so this is what he says. Fire, fire, Lord, fire gonna burn my soul. I ain't been good, I ain't been clean. I've been evil, low down, mean. Fire, fire, Lord, fire gonna burn my soul. Tell me, brother, do you believe if you want to go to heaven, got to moan and grieve? Fire, fire, Lord, fire gonna burn my soul. I've been stealing, been telling lies, had more women than Pharaoh had wives. Fire, fire, Lord, fire gonna burn my soul. I mean fire, Lord, fire gonna burn my soul. And then, one who is not afraid of Judgment Day might say something like this in a poem that is called Judgment Day. They put my body in the ground, my soul went flying o'er the town, went flying to the stars and moon, a-shouting, God, I's coming soon. Oh, Jesus. Lord in heaven, crown on his head, says, don't be afraid, 'cause you ain't dead. Kind Jesus. And now I'm setting clean and bright in the sweet of my Lord's sight. Clean and bright, clean and bright. For a time in my childhood, I lived in Kansas City. And Kansas City, as almost everybody knows, is one of the centers of American jazz. From Kansas City have come such fine jazz musicians as Mary Lou Williams and Count Basie and, quite a number of others. At any rate, when I was a kid in Kansas City, very often I used to hear the blues. There were blind guitar players who would sing the blues on street corners. There were people plunking the blues on beat-up old pianos. That was, of course, before the days of the jukebox and the radio, and in those days, almost everybody who could afford to have a piano had one and played them in their homes. And so you heard a lot of live music. Well, at any rate, I was very much attracted to the blues, and I remember even now some of the blues verses that I used to hear as a child in Kansas City. And so I, in my early beginnings at poetry writing, tried to weave the blues into my poetry. One of the poems that I wrote in Harlem in the 1920s is a poem called The Weary Blues. Droning a drowsy, syncopated tune, rocking back and forth to a mellow croon, I heard a Negro play. Down on Lenox Avenue the other night, by the pale, dull pallor of an old gas light, he did a lazy sway. He did a lazy sway to the tune of those weary blues. With his ebony hands on each ivory key, he made that poor piano moan with melody. Oh, blues! Swaying to and fro on his rickety stool, he played that sad, raggy tune like a musical fool. Sweet blues, coming from a black man's soul. Oh, blues! In a deep song voice with a melancholy tone, I heard that Negro sing, that old piano moan. Ain't got nobody in all this world, ain't got nobody but myself. I was going to quit my frowning and put my troubles on the shelf. Thump, 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 went his foot on the floor, played a few chords, then he sang some more. I got the weary blues and I can't be satisfied. Got the weary blues, can't be satisfied. I ain't happy no more, and I wish that I had died. Far into the night he crooned that tune. The stars went out, and so did the moon. The singer stopped playing and went to bed, while the weary blues echoed through his head. He slept like a rock, or a man that's dead. Bad morning. Here I sat with my shoes mismated. Lordy mercy, I was frustrated. Could be Hastings Street or Lenox Avenue. Could be 18th and Vine and still be true. Could be 5th and Mound, could be Rampart. When you pawn my watch, you pawn my heart. Could be you love me. Could be that you don't. Might be that you'll come back. Like as not, you won't. Hastings Street is weary, also Lenox Avenue. Any place is dreary without my watch and you. Bad luck card. 'Cause you don't love me is awful, awful hard. Gypsy done showed me my bad luck card. There ain't no good left in this world for me. Gypsy done told me, unlucky as can be. I don't know what poor weary me can do. Gypsy says, I'd kill myself if I was you. But usually people don't go around killing themselves, and this particular character that I must have had in mind when I was writing these poems certainly didn't kill himself. In fact, there is a poem about him called Life is Fine, and tells about his thoughts on suicide and how they work out. The poem goes like this. I went down to the river. I sat down on the bank. I tried to think but couldn't, so I jumped in and sank. I came up once and hollered. I came up twice and cried. If that water hadn't been so cold, I might have sunk and died. But it was cold in that water. It was cold. I took the elevator 16 floors above the ground. I thought about my baby and I thought I would jump down. I stood there and I hollered. Stood there and I cried. If it hadn't been so high up there, you know I might have jumped and died. But it was high up there. It was high. So since I'm still here living, I guess I will live on. I could have died for love, but for living I was born. Though you may hear me holler and you may see me cry, I'll be dog, sweet baby, if you're gonna see me die. 'Cause life is fine, fine as wine. Life is fine. Well, sometimes in writing the poetry of the blues, I've tried to write in the exact format of the traditional folk blues. The blues have a strict lyric pattern. It's one long line repeated and a third line that rhymes with the first two. And, of course, the blues have a musical pattern, too, usually a 12-bar pattern. The blues also have a unique quality, I think, in that they combine usually both sadness and humor. Almost every traditional blues is about some rather sad situation, and yet somewhere along toward the end of the song, usually the last line of a blues verse, there's a funny little twist that will make people laugh. I've tried to get that quality into my, shall we call them, created blues, because, of course, I consciously write these, and so I guess you can't call them real folk blues, unless you want to say that I'm a folk poet, myself a folk person, which maybe I am. I'll read you one called Bound North Blues. Well, it might be about somebody who has just come out of Mississippi. Going down the road, Lord, going down the road, Lord, way, way down the road. Got to find somebody to help me carry this load. Roads in front of me, nothing to do but walk. Roads in front of me, walk and walk and walk. I'd like to meet a good friend to come along and talk. Hates to be lonely. Lord, I hates to be sad. Says I hates to be lonely. Hates to be lonely and sad. But every friend you find seems like they try to do you bad. Road, 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 oh, road, 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 road. Road, 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 oh, on the northern road. These Mississippi towns ain't fit for a hoppin' toad. Well, of course, the rent is usually not heaven sent. You have to work for it. And that is one reason why I have written so many other things other than poetry. I hope that if I ever get enough, not laurels, but greenbacks to retire from having to make a living from writing, that I will then have time again to write maybe almost nothing but poetry. I worked for a time in a nightclub in Paris, and since that time I have had a great deal of association with people in the theater and jazz musicians who work in nightclubs. When I worked in a nightclub, I was technically called a second cook, but actually dishwasher at the Grand Duke on the Rue Pigalle in Paris. That was back in the 20s. So I had really no association with the music end of the club, but every night I used to hear this jazz band playing, very good Negro jazz band from New York, and I began to try to put the syncopated rhythms of jazz into my poetry. And perhaps you might feel those rhythms in some of the poems that I'm going to read at this moment. This is a poem called Midnight Raffle. I put my nickel in the raffle of the night. Somehow that raffle didn't turn out right. I lost my nickel, I lost my time. I got back home without a dime. When I dropped that nickel in the subway slot, I wouldn't have dropped it, knowing what I got. I could just as well have stayed home inside. My bread wasn't buttered on neither side. Miss Blues's Child. If the blues would let me, Lord knows I would smile. If the blues would let me, I would smile, smile, smile. Instead of that, I'm crying. I must be Miss Blues's child. You were my moon up in the sky, at night my wishing star. I love you, oh, I love you so, but you have gone so far. Now my days are lonely, and nighttime drives me wild. In my heart I'm crying. I'm just Miss Blues's child. This one, written during the mid-1940s, it's an attempt to get something of the quality and feeling of bebop music into poetry. The poem is called Dream Boogie. Good morning, Daddy. Ain't you heard the boogie-woogie rumble of a dream deferred? Listen closely. You'll hear their feet, beating out and beating out a... You think it's a happy beat? Listen to it closely. Ain't you heard something underneath like a... What did I say? Sure, I'm happy. Take it away. Hey, Pop, rebop, mop. Yay. In a more serious vein, and yet at the same time attempting to keep something of the humor of the folk Negro, even in the face of a serious situation, I've written this poem called Ku Klux. This particular poem, if I remember correctly, was written in Washington. For a time in 1924-25, I lived in Washington. I worked as a busboy at the Warden Park Hotel, and it was there that the great poet Vachel Lindsay came to have luncheon one day, and I saw him in the dining room, and so I quickly wrote out 3 of my poems on some scrap paper I found around the pantry somewhere, and I put these poems down beside Vachel Lindsay's plate and muttered something about, I like your poetry, and I'm trying to write poetry too, and I went away. I was very shy in those days. I guess still am shy in a sense, particularly when it comes to celebrities. Well, I never saw Vachel Lindsay again. He was reading his poems that night in the little theater of the Warden Park Hotel, but at that time in Washington, colored people could not go to the theaters. We couldn't buy tickets to the National or anywhere else except theaters in the Negro neighborhoods. And so I couldn't go to hear Vachel Lindsay read his poems, and I didn't know until the next morning what happened at that program. When I got out to the Warden Park Hotel about 7 o'clock the next morning, going to work, the head waiter said to me, "There are some reporters waiting for you in the dining room." And I said, "Reporters waiting for me? What have I done?" And he said, "Well, I don't know, but they want to interview you." And so I got into my busboy uniform and I went in the dining room, and sure enough, there were a couple of reporters and a photographer. And they said, "You've been discovered." And I said, "What?" And they said, "Why, don't you know Vachel Lindsay read your poems last night to a very distinguished audience of congressmen and literary people, and he says that you're a fine poet. And he says that he has discovered right here in this hotel a busboy who's working as a busboy, but who is also a very good poet. They said, you're discovered, and we want to write about you." So they interviewed me and found out where I went to school and all sorts of things, and what kind of poetry I wrote, and asked me to give them some of the poetry to publish in the paper. And there appeared in the Washington Star an interview which I believe was syndicated across the country. And my picture holding up a tray of dirty dishes in the middle of the Warden Park dining room was in the paper, and that was my first publicity break. About that time, in Washington, there was held a Ku Klux Klan parade. Down Pennsylvania Avenue, the Klan paraded in white robes and hoods, masks, and I saw this parade myself, and I was sort of, well, in a way, moved by it because, of course, the Klan has been the organization that, since emancipation, had terrorized the Negro people in the South, and it seemed rather odd to me that they should be parading down the streets of our capital. And so it was around that time that I wrote this poem called Ku Klux Klan. The poem itself is about a problem which is still not solved in the South, the problem of the Negro and the right to vote. There are some portions of our country where, if you're colored, you practically take your life in your hands when you want to go to the ballot box. Well, in the poem, this young colored man, is telling about what happened to him when he wanted to vote. It goes like this. They took me out to some lonesome place. They said, "Do you believe in the great white race?" I said, "Mister, to tell you the truth, I'd believe in anything if you'd just turn me loose." The white man said, "Boy, can it be you are standing there assassing me?" They hit me in the head and knocked me down. Then they kicked me on the ground. A Klansman said, "Nigger, look me in the face and tell me you believe in the great white race." Well, of course, that poem was written long before the war, and we fought a war to help rid the world of that sort of racial supremacy theory. Well, I guess the war helped a little bit, but we still haven't quite gotten rid of some of those kinds of ideas in some portions of our country. And maybe the reason the word Mississippi occurs so often in my poems is that to Negroes, Mississippi happens to be one of the states that symbolizes racial bigotry and intolerance and lynching and brutality. This is a poem called Roland Hayes Beaton, and it happened that the distinguished Negro singer, famous all over the world, chose to go back to his home state, Georgia, and live for a time in Georgia one day in a small town near the plantation which he had purchased. He went in to buy a pair of shoes and happened to sit down on a bench which the clerk said was reserved for white people, that no Negroes should sit on this bench in this shoe shop or shoe store. And apparently Roland Hayes didn't move fast enough, and he was attacked by the shoe clerk and beaten. So I wrote this poem, Roland Hayes Beaten, Georgia, 1942. Negroes, sweet and docile, meek, humble, and kind, beware the day they change their minds. Wind in the cotton fields, gentle breeze, beware the hour it uproots trees. And this is a poem about a lynching. The poem is called Silhouette. Southern gentle lady, do not swoon. They've just hung a black man in the dark of the moon. They've hung a black man to a roadside tree in the dark of the moon, for the world to see how Dixie protects its white womanhood. Southern gentle lady, be good, be good. Song for a Dark Girl. Way down south in Dixie, break the heart of me, they hung my black young lover to a crossroads tree. Way down south in Dixie, bruised body high in air, I asked the white Lord Jesus, what was the use of prayer? Way down south in Dixie, break the heart of me, love is a naked shadow on a gnarled and naked tree. Here are some poems about Negroes who migrated from the South, who come to the big cities of the North looking for better jobs, better schools to educate their children, better places to live. This poem is called One-Way Ticket. I pick up my life and take it with me, and I put it down in Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Scranton, Harlem, any place that is north and east and not Dixie. I pick up my life and take it on the train to Los Angeles, Bakersfield, Seattle, Oakland, Salt Lake, any place that is north and west and not south. I am fed up with Jim Crow laws, people who are cruel and afraid, who lynch and run, who are scared of me and me of them. I pick up my life and take it away on a one-way ticket, gone up north, gone out west, gone. But of course, up north and out west and anywhere that people live, there are problems of one sort or another, but the old problems of Jim Crowism and segregation and terror, they're usually left pretty far behind. You don't find the excesses of race prejudice in northern or western cities. And so here is a poem about a girl who is graduating in, let's say, in a town like Chicago. The poem is called Graduation. Cinnamon and rayon, jet and coconut eyes, Mary Lulu Jackson smooths the skirt at her thighs. Mama, portly oven, brings remainders from the kitchen where the people all are icebergs wrapped in checks and wealthy. Diploma in its new frame. Mary Lulu Jackson, eating chicken, tells her mama she's a typist, and the clicking of the keys will spell the name of a job in a fine office, far removed from basic oven, cook stoves, and iceberg's kitchen. Mama says, praise Jesus, until then I'll bring home chicken. The diploma burst its frame to scatter stardust in their eyes. Mama says, praise Jesus, the colored race will rise. Mama says, praise Jesus. Then, because she's tired, she sighs. Many of my poems have been about the problems of working people trying to get ahead in the world, working people both white and Negro, the problems of trying to educate your children when you don't have very much money. This one is perhaps the best known of my poems in that manner. It's a poem called Mother to Son. It has been set to music a number of times. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it, and splinters, and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor. There. But all the time, I's been a-climbing on, and reaching landings and turning corners, and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So, boy, don't you turn back. Don't you set on the steps 'cause you find it's kind of hard. Don't you fall now, for I's still going, honey. I's still climbing, and life for me ain't been no crystal stair. I would like to read you a few of the lyric poems that originally appeared in Fields of Wonder. Borderline. I used to wonder about living and dying. I think the difference lies between tears and crying. I used to wonder about here and there. I think the distance is nowhere. Genius Child. This is a song for the genius child. Sing it softly, for the song is wild. Sing it softly as ever you can, lest the song get out of hand. Nobody loves a genius child. Can you love an eagle, tame or wild? Wild or tame, can you love a monster of frightening name? Nobody loves a genius child. Kill him, and let his soul run wild. And this is almost the shortest poem I ever wrote, a poem called Suicide's Note. The calm, cool face of the river asked me for a kiss. But even shorter than that one is a poem of mine whose title is longer than the poem itself. The title is a little lyric of great importance, and the poem is, I wish the rent was heaven sent. Would like to read you one about bop characters. This one called Motto. I play it cool and dig all jive. That's the reason I stay alive. My motto, as I live and learn, is dig and be dug in return. And then this one called Flatted Fifths, which is very hard to say. Flatted Fifths, F-I-F-T-H-S. Little colored boys with beards, rebop, bebop, mop and stop. Little colored boys with fears, frantic, kick their drafty years into flatted fifths and flatter beers. Flatted fifths, flatter beers, that out of sudden change become sparkling oriental wines, rich and strange. Silken bathrobes with gold twines, and Heilbronner Crawford, not undreamed of Lewis combines in silver thread and diamond notes on trademarks inside Howard coats. Little colored boys in berets, oop papada, horse a fantasy of days, ooh yaku, and dig all plays. Bebop boys implore Mecca to achieve 6 discs with Decca. And in conclusion, I would like to read a few of my poems, 2 or 3 poems of hope for the future in relation to the race problem in this country of ours. I might, as a prelude to those poems, read one called Harlem, which happens to be the poem that has given the title to a hit play, A Raisin in the Sun. The title comes from the 3rd line in this poem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Some of my poems are very definitely poems of hope, poems that try to say that I believe that the great ideals of American democracy will certainly eventually be worked out for everybody in our country, everywhere in our country. This is a poem called Democracy. Democracy will not come today, this year, nor ever through compromise and fear. I have as much right as the other fellow has to stand on my 2 feet and own the land. I tire so of hearing people say, let things take their course, tomorrow is another day. I do not need my freedom when I'm dead. I cannot live on tomorrow's bread. Freedom is a strong seed planted in a great need. I live here too. I want freedom just as you. Refugee in America. There are words like freedom, sweet and wonderful to say. On my heartstrings, freedom sings all day, every day. There are words like liberty that almost make me cry. If you had known what I knew, you would know why. And this one called Tomorrow. We have tomorrow bright before us like a flame, yesterday a night-gone thing, a sundown name, and dawn today, broad arch above the road we came. We march, Americans together, we march. And in conclusion, I think perhaps I might read one of the poems that I like best of all my little poems. And for some reason, I lean toward short poems. I think, to me, the shorter poems are usually the better. In my opinion, poetry should sort of be the essence of an emotion. If you want to say a great deal about the way you feel about something or describe in detail a situation, then you write a short story or you write a novel. But if you want to compress into just a very few words the very essence of an emotion or a feeling, then you write a poem. This is one of my favorite little poems called No Regrets. Out of love, no regrets, though the goodness be wasted forever. Out of love, no regrets, though the return be never.